Hello, hello, hello. In recent years, we have seen a huge political shift towards globalist, open borders, pro-queer, pro-foreigner policies. These policies have been avidly adopted by Celtic Nationalist Parties. Does this seem odd to you? Pro-foreigner nationalists? You're not the only one who thinks this is utterly mental. Allow me then to explain why exactly the CeltNats have gone woke. Naturally, the history of Celtic nationalism is varied. I could waste your time by talking about the history of Celts in Britain, but instead I'll keep it brief by saying that the English conquered the Welsh in the 1400s, conquered the Irish in the 1600s, and unified peacefully with Scotland in 1603, though there had been many wars before then. Following the unifications, there were then periods of forced assimilation efforts. As such, due to the time and manner of unification, the Welsh are the most loyal to the crown, with less than a third wanting independence, then the Scottish, with slightly less than half wanting independence, and the Irish, who are already independent. The exact political makeup of Celtic nationalists obviously differs between the three nations, and obviously they are too broad of a group to assign a single political ideology. But for the most part, I'm considering the CeltNat elements that are either explicitly woke or socialist, or captured by woke or socialist ideals, which is the vast majority of them. I should also say that, by definition, that makes these groups nationalist socialists, like the 1930s Germans. But don't let that mislead you. These groups were not far-right, but strongly left-wing. Indeed, I believe nationalist socialists to only be classed as far-right after World War II, really on the grounds of nationalism, but the socialism element is still far-left. In the hierarchy of socialism, the peak of all evil is industrial capitalism and imperialism, whilst being victims of capitalist and imperialist oppression is seen to make you morally virtuous. But this leaves the historically informed CeltNat leftists in a bit of a conundrum. After all, the Celts were heavily involved in the imperial project. The Scots and Irish were avid colonisers. The Scots particularly were involved in the empire's finances, founding giant institutions such as HSBC. And the Welsh too were highly involved, with all three Celtic nations having many regiments in the British Army, or businesses in the empire. Plenty of videos on YouTube detail the involvement of Celts in the empire. I didn't get too far into it here, other than to say they were highly involved. So, how do you square this huge involvement in what the left considers the peak of all evil with the simultaneous desire to see your people as morally good? Simple. Claim oppression. Initially, of course, this wasn't done under the woke framing at all. I mean, that makes sense, wokeness wasn't yet even a concept in the early 1900s. Instead, oppression was and still is claimed on nationalist lines, citing a history of forced cultural assimilation, suppression of language, conquest, and so on. And in the special case of Ireland, the oppression was claimed on religious lines, as Britain had been strictly anti-Catholic. Plus there was also the shameful Irish famine. To be fair, these historical grievances are legitimate, though arguably not unusual for the times, and they were hardly serious problems come the 1900s. But of course, this narrative of history is still at odds with the Celts' more recent history of involvement in the empire, which the left would consider the oppressors. In fact, this dichotomy of perceived oppression is impossible to truly square in a socialist framing. Socialism has no room for that sort of nuance. It is precisely the impossibility of reconciling being among the supposed evildoers with the socialist desire to be among the virtuous victims that makes CeltNats so ridiculous. Whilst the founding ideologies of the left-wing elements of Celtic nationalism were closer to the old type of class socialism or nationalist socialism, these ideas gradually fell out of fashion. The CeltNat leftists thus needed a new socialist adaptation to claim oppression. That ideology arrived in the form of wokeness. Wokeness, which I define as intersectional neo-Marxism and explain here, essentially paints the British Empire and America and the archetypical American or Victorian British man as the epitome of evil on multiple grounds, be they sex, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and so on. The actual terms of wokeness aren't so important in this story, but what matters are the ideas. Wokeness was this hot, fashionable new form of socialism that really captured the naive leftist imagination. It was no longer about smashing people's shops or blowing up people's cars in Belfast. It was about helping the poor, defenceless minorities, or so they say. So, despite the contradictions between nationalism and wokeness, which is inherently globalist and pro-foreigner, CeltNats adopted wokeness with open arms, including all that comes along with it. In order to not appear to be oppressing minorities, pro-immigration policies were adopted. These ideas, which are far removed from the founding nationalist socialism of the Celts, weren't taken up for optics. No, this was instead a desperate effort to convince themselves that they aren't evil. I mean, these people are so scared of doing anything remotely like what was done in 1930s and 40s Germany that they forget whatever principles they had for themselves. But, in the special case of the Celts, they are especially desperate to prove to themselves that they were never part of the British imperial project, only victims of it. It's frankly absurd that these politicians and activists can still call themselves nationalist as they flood their countries with people not of their ethnic nation. But, in the eyes of many, the political aims have indeed worked. Many people today do consider the Celts to be victims of the English and have little to no idea of the extent of Celts' involvement in the empire. They haven't reconciled being what they consider both oppressor and oppressed. They've instead gaslit themselves into forgetting the oppressor part entirely and adopting the ideology of the oppressed. So, in conclusion, the CeltNats didn't get woke because wokeness was forced upon them. Ultimately, they became woke simply because it was the political fashion, and is the most appealing ideology to the naive leftist mind. But the Celts have a special desperation to prove that they weren't part of the British Empire, despite the fact that they totally were. And it is this desperation that makes them go so hard with the woke stuff. It's a psychological defence mechanism, then distributed among many Celtic nationalist individuals, that evolves into social pressures and then official party policy. They are so desperate to not be seen like us that they flood their land with foreigners and abandon any nationalist principles they once had. Frankly, it's pathetic. In any case, I hope you have found this informative. I encourage you to put any questions in the comments. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, and God save the King.